The courtroom was silent, but the air was heavy. All eyes were fixed on the woman standing behind the bench, Judge Lena Ray. Her robe clung to her like a second skin, her expression unreadable. In front of her stood Henry Jake, the man who once had the world at his feet. Now, that same man looked at her as if his life depended on what she would say next. And maybe it did. Lena's voice was calm, steady. But inside, she was unraveling. We are here today because the evidence suggests that Jake Tech, under your leadership, suppressed a whistleblower report that endangered millions, she said, her words clear and sharp. And while the jury has found no criminal intent, it doesn't make you innocent in my eyes, Mr. Jake. Henry didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just stood there, letting her words slice through the silence. This wasn't just about a trial. This wasn't just about the media storm or the stock market collapse that followed. It wasn't about the political tension boiling outside the courthouse or the fact that people wanted a public figure to fall. It was about one night, one moment that changed everything. And now it was slipping through his fingers. Because Lena Ray, the woman he fell in love with, was the one standing in judgment of him. 3 months earlier, Henry Jake didn't believe in love. He believed in deals, numbers, and logic. Love was for people who had time to lose themselves in fantasy. He had a tech empire to run, investors to please, and a reputation that left no room for weakness. He wasn't cold. He just couldn't afford warmth. That's why he never stayed with anyone for more than a few weeks. That's why he rejected offers, flirtation, and anything that looked remotely like commitment. His heart had walls higher than any firewall his company had ever built. Until he met her. He hadn't even planned to go to the charity gala that night. It was one of those political corporate events where everyone wore fake smiles and traded business cards they'd never use. But his assistant insisted. Just show your face. Shake a few hands. Donate something impressive. He wore a navy tuxedo and brought his usual charm, but none of it mattered the moment he saw her across the room. She was alone, sipping water, scanning the crowd like she didn't want to be there. Her beauty wasn't flashy. It was quiet, composed. Her eyes didn't beg for attention. They dared you to understand her. He asked someone, "Who's that?" "That's Judge Lena Ray," they whispered like she was royalty. Federal judge. The real deal. Strict, brilliant, and impossible to impress. Challenge accepted, Henry thought. When he introduced himself, she barely looked up. "Henry Jake," he said, offering his hand. "Tech guy. Probably someone you don't have time for." She finally looked at him, her eyes calm and assessing. "I know who you are," she said, "and you still won't shake my hand." "I'm still deciding," she replied. He laughed, a real one. "I like you already." She didn't laugh, but he saw the edge of a smile tug at her lips. They ended up talking for 2 hours that night. About justice, power, technology, and how people forget the cost of their success. She didn't flatter him. She challenged him. It was the first time in years he felt awake. At the end of the night, he asked to see her again. She hesitated. "I don't usually date powerful men." "Why not?" "Because most of them think their success makes them right about everything." He stepped closer. "Then let me prove I'm the exception." She gave him a look that wasn't quite yes, but it wasn't no either. For weeks, they saw each other quietly. Dinners at private locations, long walks late at night, heated debates over ethics and ambition. She made him question things he'd always accepted. She didn't need his money. She didn't care about his title. He found himself wanting to be better. Not for his company. For her. But there was always a shadow. Something unspoken in the way she pulled back just when things got too close. One night, in the middle of a rainstorm, she let herself go. She showed up at his place, soaked, shaking, her eyes wild. "I just needed to see you," she said. He wrapped her in a blanket, pulled her close. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That night, he held her like he'd never let her go. And in the morning, she was gone. No note. No message. Nothing. She disappeared like a dream, and Henry felt something he didn't know he was capable of feeling. Loss. 2 weeks later, his company was under investigation. A whistleblower had accused Jake Tech of suppressing critical safety information about a data tracking device used by the government. The media exploded. Stock prices crashed. And then came the biggest blow. The case had been assigned to Judge Lena Ray. His Lena. He tried to reach her, but she didn't respond. He didn't care about the headlines. He didn't care about the money. All he wanted was to hear her voice, to understand why she left. But when they finally locked eyes again, it was in a courtroom. She didn't flinch. And he knew then. She had chosen justice over him. Every time Henry entered the courtroom, he felt her presence before he saw her. Lena was different now, colder, more guarded. Her words were razor-sharp, and her eyes never lingered on him longer than necessary. She never smiled, never faltered. But he knew her too well to believe it was real. This was her armor, her way of surviving the storm. The media had turned it into a spectacle. Federal judge faces ex-lover in historic corporate trial. Talk shows and political commentators speculated about their past. But she never said a word. She stuck to the facts, to the rules. And Henry? He followed every order she gave. No arguments. No manipulation. Because the truth was, he respected her more than anyone. But the silence between them was killing him. Every night, he thought about her. About that night in the rain. About the way she trembled when he touched her. About the way she looked at him, like she didn't want to fall, but already had. She had meant something. She still did. And he couldn't accept that it was over. Henry's legal team begged him to play hardball, to fight back, discredit the whistleblower, use every loophole. But he refused. "I'm not burying the truth," he said. "Not this time." They stared at him like he'd lost his mind. But he knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about proving to Lena that he had changed. That one night with her wasn't just passion. It was the start of a different life, a better one. Late one night, he stood alone on the courthouse steps and saw her walking out. She stopped when she saw him. "I won't talk to you about the case," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not here for that." She crossed her arms, waiting. He took a step closer. "You left without a word." "I had to." "Why?" "Because I was starting to believe you were different, and I couldn't afford to be wrong." His voice cracked. "You weren't wrong, Lena." She looked away. He tried again. "Do you really think I would have let everything fall apart just to get your attention? Do you think I'd risk my name, my legacy, just for show?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. "I believe in you," he said. And for a moment, the wall cracked. She looked up at him, and he saw it, the pain, the longing, the fear. But then she turned and walked away. And Henry knew he would have to do more than confess. He would have to prove it. During the final days of the trial, Henry did something no one expected. He took the stand himself. His lawyers were against it. "You'll get torn apart," they warned. "There's too much at stake." But he didn't care. He looked right at Lena as he spoke. "Yes, mistakes were made at my company," he said. "But I didn't silence the report. I wasn't even aware it existed until it was too late. That's on me. I built something too big to watch over, and I let ambition blind me." The courtroom was silent. "I'm not proud of that. But I'm here now, not to hide behind lawyers or shareholders, but to take responsibility." And then he did the unthinkable. "I've already stepped down as CEO," he said. "Effective immediately. I will spend the next year working with safety regulators and consumer protection groups to fix this, from the ground up." A gasp ran through the crowd. His lawyers stared at him in disbelief. But Henry didn't look at them. He looked at her. And in that moment, Lena's eyes finally softened. The jury returned a verdict. Not guilty of criminal wrongdoing. But the damage had been done, financially, publicly, and emotionally. Still, Henry didn't care. He waited outside the courthouse, watching reporters flood past him, chasing others. Lena emerged a few minutes later. Her eyes scanned the crowd, then stopped on him. She walked over slowly. He stood, unsure if she'd slap him or speak. But she didn't do either. She just said, "I read your resignation letter. You didn't have to go that far." "I did," he said quietly. Because I didn't want to be the man who ruined everything good in his life and blamed it on ambition. Her lips parted slightly. I didn't do it for the cameras, he said. I did it for me. And for you. They stood in silence. And then, finally, she spoke the words he'd been dying to hear. You still mean something to me. His breath hitched. I never stopped thinking about you, she added, her voice breaking. But I couldn't let love get in the way of justice. He nodded slowly. And now, she stepped closer. Now, maybe we don't have to choose. Months passed. Henry stayed out of the spotlight. He kept his word, volunteering with watchdog groups, speaking out against corporate abuse. He had nothing to gain. But he did it anyway. Lena returned to her quiet, disciplined life. But it felt less lonely now. Because at the end of long days, there were messages waiting. Calls. Quiet dinners. Long walks where they didn't talk about cases or rules, just life. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Love had waited this long. One rainy evening, back on the steps of her brownstone, he pulled out a small box. Her eyes widened. Henry. It's not a proposal, he said quickly. Not yet. She looked confused. It's a key, he said. To my new apartment. Just come over more. Stay when you want. Leave when you want. I don't want to cage you. I just want to be where you are. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm not asking you to stop being a judge. I'm not asking you to give up anything. He took her hand gently. I just want to share the life you already have. If you'll let me. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled. It was a quiet night. No rain. No courtroom. Just the two of them in a small cabin by the lake. She curled against him on the couch, her head on his chest. Do you remember that night? She asked. The one where I showed up out of nowhere. How could I forget? He said. I was scared, she whispered, because I knew I was falling. He kissed her hair. Me too. She sat up, looking into his eyes. You never asked what happened to me before I met you. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She nodded slowly. Years ago, I dated someone who used me to get to people I worked with. He turned out to be corrupt, and I had to turn him in. Henry's chest tightened. I told myself I'd never let my heart cloud my judgment again. You didn't, he said gently. You were stronger than anyone I know. She smiled through tears. But you, she whispered, you made me believe that love doesn't have to make me weak. It can make me whole. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and slow. And, in that quiet cabin, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by peace and honesty, they made love again, not like before, not rushed or desperate, but steady, knowing, sacred. Not a beginning, not an end, just love. A year later, in a small private ceremony, Lena walked down the aisle in a simple cream dress. No reporters, no cameras, just her and Henry. He took her hands, looked into her eyes, and said, You were the one I never saw coming. And now, I never want to look away again. And as the wind whispered through the trees and their vows echoed under the open sky, Henry Jake, the man who once rejected love at every turn, finally surrendered to the one thing he could never escape. Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here and supporting what I do. Your comments and feedback mean the world to me. If you enjoyed this, please take a moment to leave a comment and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future updates. I love hearing from you, and your support helps keep this community growing. Thanks again, and let's keep the conversation going.